Hi, welcome to my second lecture narration um, on part two of neuroscience and the biological foundations of psychology. Last time we talked about the neuron and how communication works via this elementary basic element of which there are billions of the nervous system, namely the nerve cell or the neuron. Today we're going to look more broadly at the brain and the nervous system. So the nervous system, again, where the biological causes of consciousness and behavior are rooted, okay? As we saw in the previous narration, as I briefly mentioned, there are three different kinds of neurons. There are afferent neurons or sensory neurons, which go from the periphery of the body and internal organs into the spinal cord and in turn the brain. Then there are motor or efferent neurons, which go from the brain and the spinal cord, sending out information from there to the muscles and the organs. And then there are many, many more neurons that are called interneurons, which connect sensory and motor neurons as well as other interneurons. They're the connectors, they're the integrators. Okay, so the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. In effect, it's everything in your nervous system that's encased in bone, either the skull or the spine. And then outside of the central nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. These are all the nerves and neurons that connect the CNS, central nervous system, to the rest of the body. Now, the peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay, and an important subdivision of that is into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which are part of what we call the autonomic nervous system. So here is a schematic, sort of a chart that sort of describes all of this. Okay, so we start with the nervous system. Okay, all the neurons, okay, and the nerves, which are comprised of many, many neurons, okay, that extend throughout the body. So we talked about the central nervous system, okay, and we divide that into the spinal cord and the brain, okay, and a little bit later we will talk about the various structures of the brain, which are listed here in brief. And then over here we have the peripheral nervous system, which as we notice, carries information to and from the central nervous system. And I talked briefly about the division into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay. Now, well, I talked about the autonomic nervous system, but that's to be distinguished from the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is that part of our nervous system which conveys sensory information to the central nervous system, sends motor messages to the muscles. And so it's all involved in our behavior and our movement, and basically it's a part of the nervous system which we could say was voluntary. Okay, so when we will ourselves to move, or we move our arms, this is something that's happening on a voluntary basis, our behavior. Okay, the autonomic nervous system, consider the term autonomic, which comes from automatic. Okay, this is an involuntary part of the system. This is the part of the nervous system that controls involuntary basic life functions like heartbeat, response to stress, things that we don't will to happen, that aren't voluntary, that just basically happen without our conscious intervention. So our heart is beating. Okay, we're not telling it to; it just is. Okay, you know, our lungs are pulsating. We're breathing. Okay, the respiration is going on in an involuntary, automatic way. And when something stresses us, we have uh, this kind of this stress kind of response. Okay, this arousal that we'll talk about next, um, which just happens. It's not something we control or make happen. Hey, I'm going to be stressed now. That doesn't happen. And then that the further division of the autonomic nervous system is into the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, which arouses the body to expend energy and respond to threat. Sympathetic nervous system takes charge in times of stress and anxiety or arousal. And then there is the parasympathetic nervous system, which basically, whoops, sorry about that, calms the body, it conserves energy. It basically is the part of the system that basically is in charge when we are in a calm, steady state, what we could call the status quo. Okay. So a couple of, actually three terms that you should remember, okay? Neuroplasticity. This basically refers to the brain's lifelong ability to reorganize and change its structure, okay, and function throughout the lifespan. Now, of course, there are limits to this, but more and more brain scientists have discovered the plasticity of our central nervous system, that that when there is harm or damage to one part of it, to perhaps one structure, it is in some cases possible that the brain will kind of restructure and take over the function that had been under the control of the damaged structure. Okay, this is something that occurs throughout the lifespan. Neuroplasticity is probably at its maximum when we're younger, but it is a lifelong ability and something that's been the subject of much research. Okay, neurogenesis is the process which we now understand by which new neurons are generated. Now, it wasn't too many years ago that scientists did not know about neurogenesis. It was thought that you were born with the maximum amount of brain cells or neurons that you would ever have, and that they die over time, but are not replaced. Okay. Indeed, when I first began teaching at the university level back in the late 1970s, even then, neurogenesis was not something we talked about in an intro psych course. The science then was telling us that no, we do not create new brain cells. But now we know we do, and that's called neurogenesis. Stem cells, which you may have heard of, these are immature, uncommitted cells with the potential to develop almost any type of cell. Obviously, I'm sure that you've been aware of scientific research in that particular realm, having to do with ways of treating certain kinds of illnesses and diseases, and stem cell research has been a major part of medicine, medical research for probably the last 15, 20 years. Okay, so let's get back to the central nervous system, the CNS. So there's the brain and there's the spinal cord, which transmits information into and out of the brain. Okay, and so here we have the brain. Here's a cross section of the spinal cord, and basically the whole idea here is out of the spinal cord might come sensory neurons. Into the spinal cord may come motor neurons controlling behavior. And indeed, there are many, many interneurons in the spinal cord which would collect this information and transmit it to the brain. Now, so the spinal cord is a conduit to the brain. But the spinal cord also may be involved in involuntary automatic kinds of behaviors, which we typically call reflexes. Okay, so reflexes basically involve stimulus response kinds of behaviors that don't require any intervention by the brain. So there's no the brain doesn't have to intervene, doesn't have to get a message and then send a message out to respond. Okay, so everything takes place in the spinal cord. So, for example, the Babinski reflex is basically when you, for example, touch an infant's the bottom of their foot, their their toes will contract automatically. When you touch to the cheek of an infant or a small child, they will orient in that direction, the rooting reflex. Okay, when you put your thumb into the open hand of an infant, it will immediately display the grasp reflex. Okay. We know about like the patellar tendon when you're sitting at the doctor's office and they, with your legs hanging off of the chair or off of the examination table, you will hit the doctor may hit your patellar tendon right in front of just below your knee and to the left a little bit with a with a rubber hammer, and you will kick your leg out to some extent. That's a reflex that doesn't require the brain to be involved. It's kind of automatic. Now, the peripheral nervous system, we saw the distinction between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic being the where the control of the conscious and voluntary control of muscle and sensory kinds of behavior occurs, and the autonomic, which basically involves involuntary bodily functions. Really important distinction is the autonomic versus the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at that. So here's an anatomy in the functions of these two subsystems within the autonomic. Okay, in terms of what they control. So remember, the sympathetic system arouses, the parasympathetic system calms. Okay, so when at the normal, we'll start on the right here, the normal sort of steady state when we're in a calm state, the parasympathetic system is in charge. Your pupils are constricted. You have an increase in salivation. There's your normal amount of salivating or spit, shall we say, in your mouth. Okay, your heart is at a slow, steady pace. Your lungs are somewhat constricted. You your body, your digestive and elimination systems are working along, digestion's going along smoothly, the elimination system of urinating and doing number two and so on and so forth. That's all um, uh, going on and just fine. Okay, we're not sweating. Um, when we're in this state, if we become if some stimulus sexually arouses us, if in the parasympathetic state, we will get an erection. If we're a man, if we're a woman, we'll have vaginal lubrication. Okay. The sympathetic system, when that kicks in, just sort of the opposite occurs. Okay. With one exception, when we talk about sexual behavior, we'll see that they tend to work in tandem. Okay, so when the sympathetic system is going, it's a state of arousal. Our pupils dilate. We get dry mouth. Okay, our heart accelerates. Our lungs dilate. We're getting to get more get more oxygen into the system. The digestive tract digestion tends to decrease. Think about getting butterflies in your stomach. We tend to sweat more. Okay, so leaving aside the sexual part of it for a second, all of these things you'll recognize as being the kinds of states that occur. The state you're in when you get fearful, when something surprises you, when something shocks you, when something uh, basically when some sort of emergency happens, putting you into a state of sympathetic nervous system arousal. Okay, we kind of get the fight or it's all tied in with a very functional aspect of human beings, which we call kind of like the fight or flee response. Okay, we're sort of wired that when something is amiss, when we get stressed out, okay, our sympathetic system, when we're aroused, our sympathetic system basically takes control, okay, and prepares you to behave, to react in some way. That's where the fight or flee, okay, kind of nomenclature comes from, okay. So sympathetic nervous system arousal is associated with the response that our body has in a state of excitement, okay, or surprise or shock or fear. And all of these things that happen, okay, prepare you to behave, to react in some way. We need to be able to see better, okay, perhaps, okay, we need to be vigilant. The pupils dilate. Salivation decreases. That's not a function that's useful when we're in an emergency or arousing situation. Our heart needs to accelerate, to pump more blood to the muscles to support any actions we might take. The lungs dilate. Okay, we need to get more air, more oxygen into the system. We need to aerate that blood. We need to have strength and alertness, so the lungs dilate. We don't need to be digesting food or doing these involuntary kinds of things at the moment, and so they tend to shut down. Sweating increases. So because we're going to be active, okay, the sweating increases to allow us to eliminate heat more readily. Okay, so all of these are sort of incompatible with the opposite of what happens when we're calm. Okay, so when we're aroused, we're prepared for reaction, and that's what the sympathetic system does. Now, there is one situation in which the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system sort of work together, not simultaneously, but sequentially. So, for example, you need to be in your parasympathetic system needs to be dominant or in charge in order to experience sexual arousal and what you need to, shall we say, have sex. Okay, so the parasympathetic system uh, is what basically controls sexual arousal. Okay, however, orgasm, okay, basically is a sympathetic nervous system function. Okay, uh, so we go from parasympathetic when we're aroused and in the act of having sex to a sympathetic system dominance in order to achieve an orgasm. So one way you can remember this is to think about um, how really difficult it is to for men to achieve an erection, and for women to achieve any kind of lubrication necessary for intercourse when you are aroused. Okay, when you are when you're stressed out, when you're nervous, when you have some sort of uh, so when you have the kind of arousal associated with the sympathetic system, this stuff just doesn't happen. Okay. Uh, so, in times of danger and extreme stress or arousal, it's really hard to go into a position that makes it possible to have sex. So, for example, sometimes men have what's called erectile dysfunction, right? In some cases, that tends to be associated more with, at least in part, with the fact that they've had some failures, if you will, and so when they approach sexual behavior, they get nervous about it, okay, because they've experienced some problems in the past, and of course, the very nervousness kicks in the sympathetic system and makes it difficult for this to happen, okay, for the arousal, for the erection to occur, okay. So that's a little bit of a digression, but it's an interesting, um, um, well, it's a useful way of understanding sexual behavior and associated kinds of the sexual arousal versus the sexual climax. Okay, but the important thing for you is to keep times of emergency, the fight or flight response, sympathetic arousal, in times of calm, parasympathetic dominance of the system. All right. So, yeah, moving right along, talk about areas of the brain and their functions. Okay. Now, I should say I have there is an animation um, in your on Blackboard. I think it's under supplementary material. Okay, that probably that is a nice little summary of it goes through with a voice talking, just like I'm talking, that goes through with pictures of the various parts of the brain, and that might be sufficient to look over to get a sense of the various areas of the brain. Okay, but one way of dividing the brain is into three parts: the brain stem and the cerebellum, just above the spinal cord. Does all the bodily coordination parts that we and basic functions that we need to occur. The limbic system is where we see the which is above the brain stem. Basically, uh, manages emotions, connects thought to the body. It's where the mind-body connection occurs. And then that outer covering, that gray matter that we know about, is where we get integration. That's called the cortex. Okay, so I'll quickly go through a couple of these. And I don't want to spend too much time I'm going to pick out a select couple of them to spend a little bit more time on, but just a little roadmap of of the brain, if you will. So uh, that's what the brainstem kind of looks like. Okay, you can see it's just extending up from the spinal cord, and the closest to the spinal cord is the medulla, followed by the pons, and this is the brainstem. And then the thalamus lies like two footballs on top of that. Um, there's the pons and medulla. Um, the medulla controls the most basic functions like heartbeat, breathing. Someone who had brain damage above the medulla could still breathe independently, but someone with damage in this area would not be able to breathe. Okay, that would be a fatal kind of damage. The pons helps coordinate automatic and unconscious movements. Then there's the thalamus. Okay, the thalamus. Okay, which comes from the term the inner chamber. Okay. It's the sensory switchboard, or if you will, if we want to use some computer analogy or internet analogy, it's the router. And all sensory messages except for smell are routed through the thalamus on the way to the cortex, which is the higher outer brain, as we know. Notice smell. Smell is the only sense that isn't routed this way. Smell is the only sense that is directly connected to, and that isn't mediated by any kind of nervous system, interneurons and sensory neurons and so on being involved. The the olfactory bulbs and the receptors in your nose, okay, directly respond to stimuli without any intervention from sensory neurons or anything like that. Okay, it's directly connected to, shall we say, the outside world. Okay, smell. Okay, smell is a very basic, perhaps the most primitive, okay, of our senses, and it has this kind of direct connection. Interesting. The other sensory messages from the other senses are all routed through the thalamus. The thalamus sends messages from the cortex to the medulla and the cerebellum. Okay, so the reticular comes from net-like, a nerve network in the brainstem, enables alertness, arousal from coma to wide awake. So studies that have been done in which you implant electrodes in for example, a cat's reticular formation, okay, depending on where you stimulate, okay, you can send with a gentle electrical stimulation the right part of the reticular formation, stimulating that might send the animal immediately into a coma. Another section puts it wide awake. Simulation of another section puts it wide awake. Okay, so it's very much involved in alertness. Filter sensor income also filters sensory information coming in. The cerebellum helps coordinate voluntary movement like playing a sport. So this has a lot to do with balance. Okay, if you have damage to the cerebellum, you're going to lose a lot of coordination. You'll be very unbalanced, and you might have a sense of just basically being out of balance. Okay, unable to coordinate with the world. Okay. It also is involved, interestingly, in nonverbal learning and in memory. The limbic system, the border system, coordinates emotions such as fear and aggression. basic drives such as hunger and sex, the formation of episodic memories. Okay, so there are some really important structures at the limbic system or within the limbic system, which have proven to be very much involved, particularly in things like emotion and motivation and in memory. Okay, so for example, the hippocampus, coming from seahorse, processes conscious episodic memories. Okay, and it's works with the amygdala to form emotionally charged memories. So when we talk about memory, we're going to be talking about uh, work with uh, several people, but in particular a subject by the name of HM, who that was the code name, who basically suffered an injury um, to the hippocampus. Okay, um, in his 20s. Okay, and as you can read in various parts of the textbook, um, from then on, okay, and after the injury, he was able to remember he had good memory for everything that happened before it, okay, before the injury, but was unable to form new memories. Okay, you would talk to him, and he would be perfectly pleasant. You could come, and then you'd leave. You could come back a half hour later. He would have no idea who you were. Okay. Um, the hippocampal lesion work with patients like HM illustrated the idea that there's a distinction between long-term memory and short-term memory. And short-term memory, you need to somehow move it into a longer-term store, or else it just goes away if you stop thinking about it. And so those memories, if you have damage to the hippocampus, um, that ability to transfer things into a long-term memory might be impaired. The amygdala, the amygdala is basically helps process emotions, especially fear and aggression. Um, it's been the subject of a lot of study in recent years because of its connection with aggression. Um, Stimulating it in animals can produce rage responses. Um, there was a famous case, just anecdotally, back in the 60s where a guy by the name of Charles Whitman climbed up on top of the University of Texas Library Tower and picked off with a high-powered rifle like around 50 people. It was at the time the largest mass killing ever in the United States. Before that, he had basically gone to his mother's house and killed her and a number of other people. When they finally got to him, and then of course he was shot and killed by SWAT teams. Autopsy revealed a tumor about the size of a walnut uh, pressing right up against his amygdala. So amygdala is associated with emotions, particularly fear and aggression. Well, there you go. As I said. And so fear and aggression. The hypothalamus. Well, the hypothalamus lies below, hence the term hypo, the thalamus. It regulates body temperature and is all involved with motivational things in terms of getting food and water, involved in sex drive. It tries to maintain what we call homeostasis, or that steady state among drives and motivations. Okay, as we saw in the previous narration, it's connected to the pituitary gland and the endocrine system. And it's interesting. The hypothalamus is a reward center. I think I may be able to put up a little short video on this. It's very short, showing a rat that is being reinforced by electrical stimulation of the hypothalamus. Okay, so um, there's sort of a pleasure center or a reward center associated in the hypothalamus that um, if it's stimulated, okay, the rat will, by implanting electrodes, the rat will experience apparently a huge level of pleasure, so that you can condition a rat even more readily by giving as a reward for behavior a stimulation of the reward center than you can by giving a hungry rat food. Okay. In fact, rats who have been conditioned uh, to press a bar, and when they do so, they get this stimulation of the hypothalamus. Okay, the the motivation it creates to get that reward is so strong. Okay, that it'll endure pain to get there. Okay, as this grid indicates. Okay, so. Um, in people, okay, that's also been studied. Okay, so for example, there are people who have been having surgery. Their brain is exposed, and perhaps they've been asked if they would like to be part of a research project where you can study these kinds of things. And people who have had their pleasure center or the reward center of their hypothalamus stimulated um, have described it as an experience of better than sex, tremendous feeling of pleasure they get, waves of it. In one um, anecdotal case, the researcher, physician who was doing this research with one female patient was recalls that in one instance he stimulated, of course, the person is completely conscious when this is happening, um, and that when he was stimulating, she was so taken by everything that she immediately proposed that she wanted to marry him right now. Okay, it was such a pleasurable thing. One of the problems, of course, if you move the electrodes to another part of the hypothalamus, you may experience intense pain. Okay, there's a review. Let me back up, whoops, a second though. Tell you a little bit more about the hypothalamus. It's a very important structure. Um, the hypothalamus is involved in maintaining this homeostasis. Is all tied in with motivation. So there's famous research that was done with rats who were studied in terms of certain parts of the hypothalamus. One part called um, the lateral hypothalamus and the ventromedial hypothalamus. Okay, the lateral hypothalamus seems to be tied in uh, with with eating behavior. And if you lesion a rat uh, at that part of the hypothalamus, the lateral, you're going to produce a rat that will never eat. It'll starve to death unless you basically force feed it. Okay. On the other hand, if you if you lesion or damage the ventromedial hypothalamus, the so-called VMH, you produce a rat that is insatiable. Okay, that'll eat and eat and eat and eat till it kills itself. In fact, there are pictures of rats with VMH lesions who are like 3 to 4 times larger, okay, than they would be if they were just eating normally. Okay, so through this kind of work, a lot was learned about how the hypothalamus is involved in the control and regulation of eating behavior. Okay, so here's a review of the brain structures. Okay, a picture like this, I'm sure, appears also in your textbook. I won't go through this um, again and more. Um, the cerebral cortex. So now we're moving up to the highest part of the brain. Now keep in mind the brain is, we can see its phylogenetic evolutionary structure, that the most primitive part of the brain, you know, um, the primitive central core that we talked about, um, the medulla and the cerebellum. Animals all up and down the evolutionary ladder have that. Okay, that evolved first. Okay, we get up to the limbic system and the midbrain. This is something that we see more of in the more advanced, if you will, in mammals. And then the cortex, okay, which is the most recently evolved structure of the brain, of course, is largest by far in human beings. So the cerebral cortex is a very thin surface layer, and it regulates most complex behavior, motor control, and those higher order mental processes. Okay, this is like, the most evolved part of the brain that allows a consciousness, self-recognition, complex thought, and so on and so forth. So there are various kinds of lobes, okay, which I'll just, there's the frontal lobe. There are actually 4 sets of lobes, okay. The frontal lobe, okay, the front of the cortex, okay, receives and coordinates messages from other lobes, okay. Actually, there's a little bit more in the following pages, so let me move on to that. The parietal lobe, okay, here's where we're where we're going to get involved with information relevant to pressure, pain, touch, temperature. The occipital lobe, okay, that's the back of the head. Interestingly, and we'll see more of this, this is where vision and visual perception, that kind of processing occurs, okay. In the back, not the front of the brain where the eyes are. Okay, and then the temporal lobe, which is associated with hearing, as well as language comprehension and some emotions. Okay, now importantly, Broca's area, and this will become important when we start talking about the so-called split brain or split brain research. Okay, Broca's area is in the lower frontal lobe and on the left side of the brain. Okay, so this is the part of the brain that controls speech and basically speech production. Okay, so it's very, very important. If you have damage there, the ability to talk and to communicate with speech would be impaired. Oh dear. Okay. Another speech-related or language-related area is in the the parietal lobe. Okay, I'm sorry, the temporal lobe. Okay, which is called Wernicke's area. This is where language comprehension occurs. Okay, so language expression, speech expression, but the comprehension of speech. Okay, the expression occurs in Broca's. Comprehension occurs in Wernicke's. Okay, and both of them tend to veer on the left hemisphere of the brain. An important point for later. There's a functional MRI scan showing what's very active. The fMRI lights up as the subject looks at faces. Okay, so facial recognition and facial processing, a lot of it's going on over here. Okay, in the visual cortex, occipital lobe. And here's brain activity as fMRIs have shown them to be when we're hearing. Okay, so Wernicke's area. Okay, when we're seeing, the visual cortex. Okay, when we're speaking, Broca's area. Okay, frontal lobes. There's some cross sections of them. The parietal lobes, we talked a little bit about these previously. So as I said, that would be reiterated in subsequent slides. And the occipital lobes located in the back of the brain, responsible for vision and visual perception. Okay. The final thing to mention, and again, I'm just sort of giving you a roadmap. You can read more about this, but you really just want to get the main points of the various structures and notice what I'm emphasizing as the more important ones from our point of view in this class, like the hypothalamus and the amygdala, and of course various aspects of the cortex. Okay, so we talk about the lobes. Okay, the four lobes, and then there are the motor and the sensory strips. Okay, so you can see right in the top of the skull, or top of the cortex. Okay. And so you have the input side, okay, so this whole strip consists of interneurons associated with receiving input from the body's right side. If we moved on to the other side of the brain, the strip would continue. And on the right side of the cortex, you'd be receiving sensory information from the left side. Okay, but we're only going to look, we'll just look at the left side of the brain, the left cerebral cortex. There are two, the left and the right. So anyways, the sensory strips, basically a bunch of lots of millions of interneurons that receive input mainly from sensory neurons, okay, about sensation, okay, and the motor cortex, okay, basically are a lot of interneurons connected to motor, okay, or afferent neurons, okay, which of course then kick out and control behavior, okay. So hence motor, okay. All right, so and so if you look at this little conceptualization, visual conceptualization here, but this basically is taking the motor strips in the cortex, and the size of the various parts of the body, okay, reflects how sensitive, okay, how many motor neurons, okay, how many neurons in the motor strip would be associated with each particular part of the body, okay. So, for example, we see a lot devoted to the lips and the jaw and the face. That's for speaking, okay. Our thumb has a lot devoted to it, as does our hand in general. The arm, not so much. And then as we move on, we know that our legs are less adept at movement and so on and so forth, because there's less devoted to the foot and the toes and so on than there is to the fingers and the hand. See the same thing on the sensory side. Okay, so we have much better sensation, a lot more devoted to sensation in our hands, and particularly our thumb, than in our foot, and a lot of sensation, okay, associated with the face, okay. Not so much with legs, knees, hips, and arms, and so on. Sensation is more limited there than it is where we really need it. Okay, and so a lot of the strip is devoted to the hand, the face. Okay, so that's an interesting depiction, and it gives you an idea of you know, where motor and sensory control basically exists in the cortex. Okay. There are two hemispheres. Okay. The two hemispheres serve some different functions. Call that lateralization. Okay, the lateralization of the brain. Basically, some functions are lateralized on one side, others on another side. Okay. And how do we know about these differences? Well, this is something that we're going to get into in class, okay, where I will continue this, a little bit of discussion of this. We'll talk about brain damage studies, the split brain studies that have taught us a lot about what our two separate hemispheres can and cannot, or do better and not so well at, and how they complement one another. So, as a prelude, you'll get that, okay? But I'm going to stop here, okay, and then continue on with this in person, okay? We will also post the slides that this lecture was based on in the lecture outlines. Okay, well, that's it for now, and we will talk to you more about this, all this in the near future. And that is in our next class.